The neighborhood looked quiet from the outside, the kind of place where people moved their lawns on Saturdays, waved to each other from their driveways, and put little flags out for the holidays. But behind the trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes, there was a tension that wasn't easy to see unless you lived there. It was the kind of tension that built slowly, fed by small grudges, whispers at HOA meetings, and the sharp glances people gave when they thought no one was looking. In a place where every house looked the same, control became its own kind of currency, and some people held on to it tighter than others. The man at the center of this story had lived here long enough to know the rules, but he had never quite fit into the picture-perfect image the HOA wanted. His home didn't have the perfect coat of paint or the manicured flowers along the walkway. He worked long hours and didn't always have time to worry about whether the shade of his shutters matched the others on the block. For him, the house was shelter and pride. It was proof of years of hard work, something that he could finally call his own. But for someone else, someone who wanted control over every detail, his home became a target. She was known in the neighborhood as someone who paid attention to everything. People called her helpful to her face, but behind her back they used another word, Karen. She liked to correct others, liked to point out what they had done wrong, and she had no problem telling people exactly how their house, their yard, even their lives should look. At first, it seemed like harmless bickering, the kind of thing neighbors eventually learned to ignore. But with her, it never stopped. Every small detail turned into a reason to complain, to call, to threaten with HOA fines. And as the months passed, it became more than just about the rules of the neighborhood. On the surface, life went on like normal. Kids rode bikes in the street, families gathered around backyard grills, sprinklers clicked across lawns in the evening. But in the background, there was a steady hum of conflict building. She saw him as someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't respect the order she believed kept the neighborhood safe. He saw her as a bully hiding behind rules, someone who used power where it wasn't meant to be used. What began as complaints about grass length and paint color shifted into something heavier, something that carried an edge of personal resentment. He had learned to hold his tongue at the HOA meetings, nodding when she lectured, pretending not to hear the digs about how some people don't understand the standards here. But inside, the words stuck. They cut deep because he knew what she really meant. It wasn't just about his shutters or his lawn. It was about him, who he was, where he came from, and the fact that no matter how hard he worked, someone like her would never see him as enough. There were moments when neighbors whispered about how far she would go. They noticed how often she walked the block, how she'd linger in front of his house just a little too long, writing notes on a clipboard, like she was an inspector rather than a neighbor. Some thought it was just her personality, controlling, obsessive, overbearing. But others felt something darker beneath it, a kind of anger that didn't seem to match the small things she complained about. It was as if she carried years of bitterness inside her, and she had found a place to pour it out. For him, the house was more than wood and brick. It was the first place where he felt like he had carved out space for himself in a world that wasn't always kind. It was the place where his family gathered, where memories grew. Every nail, every payment, every hour of overtime had gone into keeping it. That pride was something she couldn't touch, but she tried. With every letter in the mailbox, every notice taped to the door, every cold stare in the driveway, she chipped away at it. What no one knew at the time was how much hate had been growing inside her, how much she had convinced herself that getting rid of him, or what he represented, was the only way to win. The night it happened, the street was as quiet as it always was. Windows glowed with television light, porch lamps lit the sidewalks, and sprinklers ticked across the lawns. Nothing looked out of place. But in one house, there was movement that didn't belong. In the silence of that hour, a decision was made that would destroy more than just walls and wood. It was the kind of decision that came from a place far beyond neighborhood disputes, something deeper, uglier, and harder to understand. By the time the flames started, the quiet street became chaos. The smell of smoke filled the air. Alarms screamed, and shadows of neighbors rushed out in their nightclothes. Firelight danced against the perfect rows of houses, a reminder of how fragile that neat little world really was. And when the smoke cleared, when the ash settled, one man's home, the thing he had worked for, fought for, lived for, was gone. What no one expected was what would come next. Just days later, when the man walked into the courtroom looking for justice, he saw her walk through the same doors. Calm, composed, dressed like nothing had happened. She carried the same air of control, as if this were just another meeting, another rule to enforce. But this time, the stakes were far beyond lawns and shutters. This time, it was about lives shattered, a community broken, and the truth that could no longer be hidden. It didn't happen all at once. The downfall came in slow, steady waves that no one thought much of at the time. But looking back, you could see every moment where things turned sharper, where small sparks could have been smothered, but instead caught flame. What started as petty disagreements over grass height or holiday lights began to feel heavier, almost personal, like the arguments weren't about the neighborhood at all, but about the people themselves, their place, their worth, their pride. The first clear sign came during a late spring HOA meeting in the community center, one of those gatherings where neighbors sat in folding chairs with styrofoam cups of coffee while a handful of self-appointed voices decided what community standards should look like. He was there, seated quietly in the back, listening, not saying much. She was at the front, clipboard in hand, running through her agenda with the kind of precision that made others nod politely, but also roll their eyes when she wasn't looking. It should have been a simple discussion, whether the HOA should raise fees to cover new landscaping along the entrance. But she turned it into something else. She used it as a platform, pointing out chronic violations in the neighborhood. She didn't say his name, but her eyes locked on him as she listed them. Peeling paint, trash bins left out too long, a shed that didn't meet code. Each word was like a knife, delivered in a way that made everyone in the room understand exactly who she was talking about. He didn't speak up, but his silence wasn't weakness. It was a restraint. He knew that saying something then would only make it worse, but the humiliation burned in his chest. Outside pressures were building too. For him, money was always tight. The mortgage, the bills, the car repairs. Every month was a juggling act, and sometimes one ball fell. He worked long shifts, sometimes double shifts, and still, it never seemed like enough. To her, though, none of that mattered. Rules were rules. She didn't see the exhaustion in his eyes or the weight in his shoulders. All she saw was someone who wasn't keeping up with the neighborhood's image. Someone who, at least in her mind, didn't deserve to live among them if he couldn't respect the standards. For her, the pressure came from another place. Behind the sharp tongue and the iron grip on her clipboard, she carried her own cracks. Her marriage had collapsed years ago, leaving her bitter and convinced that people only respected her when she was in control. The HOA became her kingdom, her way of asserting power in a life where she otherwise felt powerless. Every violation she issued, every fine she approved, it gave her a sense of authority, a reminder that she mattered. Without it, she feared she was invisible. It wasn't long before the confrontations moved outside of meetings. One afternoon he came home to find a notice taped across his front door, bright and bold in red letters, "Final warning." She stood across the street, watching. When he tore it down, their eyes met, and for a moment there was no mistaking the hostility between them. It wasn't just about paint or trash bins anymore. It was personal. It was war. Neighbors began to notice the shift. They whispered about how often she brought his name up, how her complaints about him seemed to dominate every meeting, every email chain. Some said she was obsessed, that it wasn't normal to care so much about one man's house. Others said she was jealous, that his strength, his resilience, his quiet refusal to bow down, only fueled her anger. And May's, deep down, she hated the fact that he could withstand her pressure when so many others simply gave in. Things came to a head one humid summer evening. He was working in his yard, mowing the lawn, sweat soaking through his shirt. She walked up, clipboard clutched against her chest, and started pointing out problems. The grass was uneven, the hedge overgrown, the mailbox crooked. He tried to ignore her, tried to focus on the work, but she wouldn't stop. She stepped closer, voice sharper, until he killed the mower and turned to face her. The air between them was heavy. Words flew, hers, cutting and cruel. His, steady but edged with fury. A small crowd gathered on porches, pretending not to watch, but listening to every word. That night, the whole street knew what had been simmering. But it wasn't just the present that fueled her. There were old wounds, old prejudices that no one wanted to say out loud, but everyone understood. She had grown up believing certain people didn't belong, and no amount of modern politeness erased those beliefs. She wore her smile in public, but behind closed doors, she let the bitterness spill. To her, he wasn't just another homeowner. He was a symbol of everything she thought was wrong with her neighborhood, everything she thought was slipping out of her control. For him, the battles took a different toll. He carried the weight of it everywhere, into his work, into his home. He started sleeping less, pacing the floors at night, wondering how much more he could take. His family urged him to fight back, to report her harassment, but he knew how it worked. In places like this, people like her held the cards. She knew the system. She knew how to twist rules into weapons, and he knew that the moment he fought back, she'd double down. There were times when he thought about leaving, selling the house, starting over somewhere else. But every time he stopped himself. Why should he have to give up what he had worked so hard for? Why should he let her win? That stubborn pride kept him there, even as the pressure built to unbearable levels. Her obsession grew darker with time. She started driving past his house late at night, headlights off, just to see what he was doing. She told other neighbors lies, said he was dangerous, said he didn't care about their safety. The more she pushed the story, the more she convinced herself it was true. In her mind, she wasn't just fighting for rules anymore. She was fighting for the soul of the neighborhood, and she would not lose. The breaking point came in the fall, when the leaves were turning and the air carried the first bite of cold. Another notice arrived, this one threatening legal action if compliance wasn't met. He stormed into the next HOA meeting, anger finally spilling past his restraint. His voice shook as he demanded to know why she singled him out, why she couldn't leave him alone. For once, others spoke up, admitting that it had gone too far, but instead of backing down, she smiled. A cold, knowing smile that told him, and everyone else, that this wasn't over. In those weeks leading up to the fire, everything felt on edge. Neighbors avoided taking sides openly, but they chose in silence, some standing by him, others too afraid to challenge her. He walked through the streets feeling eyes on him, whispers following him. She walked with her head high, convinced she was untouchable, convinced that she had the power to bend the world to her will. Inside, though, both of them were unraveling. He wrestled with anger, fear, and exhaustion, wondering how much more he could withstand. She wrestled with a darker truth, the realization that no amount of fines, no amount of humiliation could erase the fact that she couldn't control him. And in her mind, if she couldn't control him, then she had only one option left. That choice, the one that would turn everything to ash, wasn't made in a single night. It was built through months of tension, through years of bitterness, through every whispered insult and every silent stare. By the time the match was struck, the crime wasn't just an act of destruction. It was the final expression of a war that had been brewing all along, a war that everyone saw, but no one stopped. The night of the fire began in silence, the kind of heavy, uneasy quiet that made the whole street feel like it was holding its breath. The sky was dark, moonless, clouds dragging slowly across the horizon, swallowing what little light the stars gave. Inside his home, he sat on the couch, head leaned back, the television flickering in the corner, though he wasn't watching it. He had worked another long shift, his body aching, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. The notices stacked on the kitchen counter stared back at him like threats, reminders of the war that never seemed to end. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake the feeling that something was closing in, something he couldn't name, but could feel deep in his chest. Across the street, her lights were out, but she wasn't asleep. She sat at her window in the dark, staring at his house as if the sight of it poisoned her. The papers on her own kitchen table were covered in scribbled notes, lists of violations, things she had already reported, and things she was still waiting to catch. But it wasn't enough anymore. The lists didn't give her the satisfaction they once had. She had pushed the system as far as it could go. Fines, warnings, legal threats. And still, he hadn't broken. He still lived there. He still stood tall. Every time she saw his car in the driveway, every time she saw his lights on at night, it reminded her that she hadn't won. And she couldn't bear the thought of losing. She paced her living room, heart pounding harder with every step. The idea had been forming for weeks, growing darker in the corners of her mind, and now it was louder than anything else. She told herself she wasn't crazy, that what she was about to do wasn't really her fault. He had forced her hand. He had disrespected her, disrespected the neighborhood, and disrespected the rules. She whispered those words to herself a pauseau as she moved through the house, gathering what she needed. The matchbox felt small in her hand, almost innocent, but in her mind, it was justice. The street was still and empty as she stepped outside. The only sound was the faint buzz of a street lamp, the occasional rustle of leaves against the pavement. Her footsteps were quick but careful, her body tight with adrenaline. Every shadow looked alive. Every window felt like an eye. She told herself no one would see, no one would ever know. Her pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out every thought except one. This ends tonight. Inside his house, he shifted, restless. Something, he didn't know what, kept him from going to bed. He walked through the rooms, checking locks, flipping light switches, as if trying to quiet the unease pressing against his ribs. At the front window, he paused. The street looked normal. Too normal. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A shadow, quick, low, near his driveway. He blinked, leaned closer, but it was gone before he could be sure. He told himself it was nothing, just his tired mind playing tricks. He turned away, and that was the last moment of calm he would ever know in that house. The strike of the match was almost silent, a hiss in the dark. She crouched low, shielding the tiny flame with her hand, watching it burn with a hunger that mirrored her own. Her breath came fast, uneven, as she lowered it to the pile she had prepared near the side of the house. Rags soaked in gasoline, scraps of paper, dry wood she had dragged from her yard. For a second, the flame wavered, struggling against the night air. And then it caught. In an instant, orange light licked upward, greedy and alive. Her eyes widened, pupils shrinking against the sudden glow. She staggered back, chest heaving, as the fire began to spread, climbing the siding, swallowing everything in its path. The heat was immediate, blistering, forcing her to retreat into the shadows. She wanted to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She stood frozen, both horrified and satisfied, watching as the fire roared higher, as the house she had hated for so long turned into a torch against the night sky. The crackle of wood, the snapping of glass. It was louder than she imagined, louder than she could control. And that was when fear crept in. What if someone had seen? What if it spread? What if he didn't make it out? For the first time, doubt pierced through the haze of rage. Inside, he woke, to the sound. A strange pop, followed by the shriek of the smoke alarm. He bolted upright, coughing as thick smoke already began to curl through the hallway. Heat pressed down on him, choking, suffocating, as flames clawed up the walls. His heart pounded as survival instincts took over. He shouted, ran toward the back door, eyes stinging, lungs screaming for air. Every second was chaos. The crash of falling beams, the roar of fire, the piercing alarm that seemed to scream along with him. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, drawn by the glow that lit up the sky. Cries filled the street, shouts for water, for help, for someone to call 911. People grabbed hoses, but it was useless. The fire was too big, too fast. Children clung to their parents' legs, wide-eyed, as the house cracked and groaned under the weight of the flames. The man stumbled out onto the lawn, coughing, his clothes singed, skin reddened from the heat. He fell to his knees, gasping, tears streaming from his eyes more than pain. His eyes turned toward the house, his house, the place he had built his life around, now collapsing in front of him. And somewhere in the crowd, hidden among the chaos, she stood. Her face pale, her hands trembling, trying to look like just another horrified neighbor. Her chest heaved, but her expression was carefully blank, as though she hadn't been the one to strike the match. Her mind raced, screaming at her to act normal, to blend in. She told herself over and over, no one saw. No one knows. But beneath that mask, panic clawed at her, threatening to break through. The fire engines arrived, lights flashing red against the thick smoke. Firefighters swarmed, shouting orders, dragging hoses, battling the inferno with everything they had. But the house was already lost. The flames had done their work. What remained was blackened wood, twisted metal, and the hollow sound of walls collapsing into ash. He sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown over his shoulders, staring at the destruction with empty eyes. His hands shook uncontrollably, his chest still raw from the smoke. Around him, neighbors whispered, comforted, speculated. But their voices blurred into nothing. All he could hear was the crackle of fire in his memory. All he could see was the place he had loved disappearing before him. She slipped back into her own house unnoticed, closing the door softly behind her. Her clothes reeked of smoke, her hair clung to her damp forehead. She went to the sink, ran cold water over her shaking hands, and stared at her reflection in the kitchen window. Her face looked foreign, pale, hollow-eyed, the face of someone who had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She whispered to herself that it had to be done, that it wasn't her fault, that no one would ever know. But deep down, in the quiet spaces of her mind, she knew she had just set her own life on fire too. The street burned with the smell of ash long after the flames died. The neighbors went back inside eventually, but the image of the house collapsing stayed with them. For him, the loss wasn't just wood and furniture. It was everything. Years of work, memories, proof of his place in the world, gone in one night. And for her, the illusion of control had turned into a secret she could never escape. The crime wasn't just fire. It was hate, obsession, power, all boiling over into one terrible act. And while the fire had destroyed the house, it had also revealed something much darker, something no one could ignore anymore. The war between them was no longer hidden in HOA meetings or whispered insults. It had erupted into flames, and the aftermath would consume them both. The smoke lingered for days after the fire, a sharp, acrid reminder of what had been lost. Even after the last flames were gone, the smell clung to the street, soaking into clothes, hair, and memory. Neighbors walked past the blackened ruin in silence, their usual chatter replaced by whispers that carried a mix of pity, fear, and suspicion. The house that once stood as a symbol of resilience now sat hollow and broken, its charred skeleton impossible to ignore. For him, the aftermath was crushing. He had escaped with his life, but almost nothing else. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every scrap of history had been reduced to ash. At night, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the crackle of wood collapsing, still feel the heat pushing against his skin, still taste the bitterness of smoke in his throat. He stayed with family in the days that followed, but he felt displaced, like a stranger in his own life. He moved through rooms quietly, barely speaking, carrying a weight that others couldn't fully understand. He tried to convince himself to be grateful, that he was alive, that he had survived what should have killed him. But grief doesn't follow logic. Grief doesn't listen to reason. He wasn't just mourning a house. He was mourning stability, dignity, and the sense of belonging he had fought for all those years. And beneath the grief was something sharper, anger. The kind of anger that built and built, demanding answers. He wanted to know why, wanted to believe that this wasn't random, that there was a reason someone had tried to erase him. She, meanwhile, lived inside her own storm. On the outside, she played the part of the concerned neighbor. She knocked on doors, asked if anyone needed help, even dropped off food for him through a mutual acquaintance, all the while trying to paint herself as a sympathetic figure. But behind closed doors, she unraveled. The smell of smoke haunted her too, clinging to her clothes, to her skin, no matter how many showers she took. At night she tossed in bed, jolting awake with the image of flames dancing in her mind. She told herself over and over that it wasn't her fault, that she had been pushed too far, that he had forced her into it. But even as she whispered those justifications, her heart raced and her palms sweated because some part of her knew the truth. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Her guilt came in waves. Sometimes she pushed it away entirely, burying herself in HOA business as if doubling down on her role would make the rest disappear. Other times, it hit her so hard she couldn't breathe, like when she saw him walking down the street with clothes donated by neighbors, his eyes hollow, his steps heavy. The sight made her stomach twist. But instead of remorse, she leaned on denial. In her mind, he wasn't a victim. He was the cause. He was the reason she had done what she did. The community was split. Some neighbors, JHBors rallied around him, bringing food, clothes and donations, whispering about how unfair it was that he had lost everything. Others avoided him, not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of being pulled into something bigger, fear of choosing sides, fear of confronting the idea that someone in their quiet neighborhood could have set that fire. Behind closed doors, though, the rumors spread. People remembered the arguments, the stares, the way she had singled him out. They remembered the coldness in her voice during those meetings. Slowly, suspicion grew, but no one dared to say it out loud. When the investigators arrived, they combed through the wreckage, pulling out what little evidence the flames hadn't consumed. They studied burn patterns, the smell of accelerants, and the way the fire had spread too quickly to be an accident. He watched them work, every muscle tight, waiting for them to confirm what he already believed, that someone had done this on purpose. The questions came quickly. Where had he been when it started? Who might want to hurt him? What conflicts had he been part of? His answers circled back to one name, though he was careful not to accuse her outright. Still, the weight of his words lingered in the air. For her, the investigation was a nightmare she couldn't control. Detectives knocked on doors, asked neighbors about suspicious activity, and gathered stories of the weeks leading up to the fire. Her name surfaced again and again, not in hard accusations, but in murmurs, in cautious admissions about how far she had gone in her war against him. She tried to stay calm when they questioned her, tried to mask her trembling hands by clasping them tightly together. She insisted she had been home that night asleep. She pointed to her spotless record, her reputation as the one who always looked out for the community. But her voice quivered at the edges, betraying her. The emotional toll stretched beyond the two of them. Families in the neighborhood began locking their doors earlier, keeping closer eyes on their children. The illusion of safety had been shattered. If something like this could happen here, in their perfect cul-de-sac, then what else was possible? People who once laughed together at block parties now eyed each other with suspicion. The HOA meetings grew quieter, the energy subdued, every decision shadowed by what had happened. The media picked it up before long. Local stations showed images of the charred house, interviews with shaken neighbors, and clips of him standing silently by the wreckage with tears in his eyes. Headlines framed it as a tragedy, a mysterious fire in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of story that drew clicks and curiosity. Some reports mentioned ongoing tensions in the HOA, though they never named her directly. Still, the contrast was stark. He became a figure of sympathy, the hard-working man who had lost everything. She, once seen as the organizer, the one in charge, now carried a different image, stern, controlling, someone neighbors whispered about when the cameras weren't around. And through it all, she clung to her version of the truth. She told herself she had acted out of duty, that he had been a problem for the community, that what she had done was necessary. But late at night, when the world was quiet, the lies she told herself cracked. In those hours, she saw the flames again. She heard the sound of wood splitting, of glass breaking, of his coughs tearing through the smoke. She pressed her hands against her ears to block it out, but it was always there, waiting for her when the silence returned. For him, each day became a test of endurance. He walked past the wreckage every morning, forcing himself to look at it, to remember. He couldn't allow himself to forget, not when he knew the person responsible still walked freely just across the street. The fire had destroyed his home, but it hadn't destroyed his will. If anything, it had sharpened it. Beneath the grief, beneath the exhaustion, there was determination. He wanted justice. He wanted her to pay for what she had done. And he knew, one way or another, that day would come. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that came not from the air itself, but from the weight of what hung inside it. Rows of benches creaked as neighbors shuffled in, their eyes darting toward him, then toward her. The trial had become more than just about a fire. It was about a neighborhood forced to look at itself in the mirror, about the lies that could no longer be hidden behind neat lawns and painted fences. He sat near the front, hands clasped tightly together, his gaze steady on the judge. His life had been reduced to ash, but he was still here, still standing. Every time he looked across the room at her, a storm stirred inside him. Not just anger, but disbelief. How could someone so calm, so ordinary in appearance, have done something so monstrous? She didn't look like a criminal. She looked like she always had at HOA meetings. Neat, controlled, composed. But now the same composure came across as coldness, even arrogance, as if she still believed she held the upper hand. The evidence spoke louder than her polished words. The investigators had found traces of accelerant. Neighbors had recalled seeing her walking the block at strange hours. And above all, her obsession with him had become impossible to deny. The prosecutor painted the picture clearly. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random. It was targeted. It was fueled by years of resentment and the desire to control what she never truly could. She tried to defend herself. She spoke about rules, about standards, about how much she had given to the neighborhood. She painted herself as the victim of defiance, of disrespect, of a man who didn't care about order. But her words fell flat. To the jury, to the judge, and to the community that had once tolerated her, she no longer looked like a protector of rules. She looked like a woman who had taken her bitterness and burned it into reality. The verdict came swift and sharp. Guilty. Arson. Reckless endangerment. Attempted murder. The words echoed through the courtroom, heavy and final. She stood still, jaw tight, as if refusing to let the weight of it break her. But her eyes betrayed her, flickering with panic, with the sudden understanding that she no longer had control, not of the neighborhood, not of him, not of anything. She was led away in handcuffs, the sound of chains against her wrists marking the end of her reign. For him, justice was complicated. On one hand, he had wanted this moment, had longed for it in sleepless nights when the smell of smoke haunted him. Seeing her convicted brought a sense of relief, of validation. But it didn't bring back his house. It didn't bring back the memories reduced to ash, or the sense of peace that had been shattered. He walked out of that courtroom free, but he carried scars, emotional, psychological, that no verdict could erase. The neighborhood itself never fully recovered either. The fire had left a mark, not just on the ground where the house once stood, but on the people who lived there. Block parties stopped. HOA meetings grew thin. People no longer trusted the idea that rules and order protected them. They had seen what power looked like when it twisted into obsession, and they couldn't unsee it. Some families moved away, unable to live with the shadows of what had happened. Others stayed, but they carried the story in every glance, every whispered conversation. The media lingered for months, picking apart every detail. Headlines framed it as the story of the HOA Karen who had let control consume her. Talk shows debated whether homeowner associations held too much power, whether neighborhoods built on strict rules created breeding grounds for resentment. For once, the focus wasn't on lawns and mailboxes, but on the deeper, uglier truths of suburban life. The lines between order and obsession, between authority and abuse. In the end, her life unraveled completely. Prison stripped her of the one thing she had clung to: control. Behind bars, she was no longer the enforcer, no longer the woman who dictated how others lived. She was just another inmate, her clipboard and rules replaced by the silence of a cell. And in that silence, she was left with the truth she had run from for so long. Her need for power had destroyed not just another man's life, but her own. He began slowly rebuilding, though not in the same place. The land where his house once stood was too heavy with memory, too haunted by the glow of flames. He moved elsewhere, somewhere quieter, somewhere without HOA meetings or clipped hedges to remind him of her. Starting over was painful. Every new purchase a reminder of what he had lost. Every blank wall a reminder of the photographs that would never be replaced. But in time he found strength in it. He had survived what was meant to break him, and that survival became its own kind of victory. The broader story stretched far beyond one street. It forced conversations about race, about class, about the invisible lines people drew around who belonged and who didn't. It exposed how small prejudices, left unchecked, could fester into something catastrophic. It showed how power in the wrong hands, even something as mundane as HOA authority, could become dangerous when mixed with obsession and hate. Morality, too, became harder to define in the wake of it all. She had convinced herself that she was protecting her neighborhood, that her cruelty was duty, that her hate was righteous. In her twisted logic, she was the hero of her own story. And that was perhaps the darkest truth of all, how easily people can rewrite their own actions to justify the unforgivable. For him, the lesson was different. He had learned that dignity wasn't given by houses or neighborhoods, or even acceptance from others. It came from within, from surviving and refusing to be erased. She had tried to strip him of everything, and though she had taken much, she hadn't taken him. The story of that fire will always live in the shadows of that neighborhood. The smell of smoke may have faded, but its meaning lingers. A reminder of how fragile peace can be, how easily pride and bitterness can turn into destruction. It is a story about power misused, about hate allowed to grow unchecked, and about resilience in the face of devastation. And in the end, it leaves a question that lingers long after the flames are gone. When control turns into obsession and rules turn into weapons, what does justice truly mean? For him, it meant survival. For her, it meant ruin. For the rest of us, it is a warning. a reminder that the darkest crimes don't always come from strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they come from the people living just across the street,